Hey guys, welcome back. It's Ripe again, back with another insane homeowner association story. Let's dive right into the video. This story was posted by user ArtfulDodger1431 on r/Ripe Stories. The cast is Miss Nice, a lady whom my mother got to know through her church, Miss Gossip, an HOA neighbor of Miss Nice, and then of course Susan, the HOA boss. So this story is not mine in any way or form, I'm just relaying it through my Reddit account since Miss Nice does not have one. So Miss Nice knew my mother for nearly 20 plus years until my mother's recent passing. With her permission, I'm gonna tell her tale. So for this tale, I'm calling her Miss Nice as all that she's ever been to me, and I can safely keep her anonymous. Miss Nice is one of those people who gets discouraged easily and does not like to step on toes. This is the one time she stood her ground, at least according to her. Miss Nice lived originally on the east coast of the USA, now in California. This story starts in the early 90s. When the story began, Miss Nice had just inherited her family home she grew up in. She had grown up in a nice neighborhood for her entire life. In the 90s, the HOA thing was barely getting some momentum. The members of the neighborhood, then the block and finally the area began to gather regularly discussing the advantages of having an HOA. The HOA was formed with the help of a lawyer. A new person to the neighborhood, Susan, makes herself the interim president since she had the most experience in one. That experience only being that she once lived in an HOA before. As far as Miss Nice knew, Susan stayed the HOA president for the life of the HOA, as no real elections were ever held to dethrone her. Miss Nice refused to join the HOA as she felt at the time it was a total scam to have someone tell what to do with her property and pay them to do it. Her not joining did not sit right with her neighbors, as their response was to drop by weekly and then every other day to try to convince her to join. They come armed with invitations to join the monthly meetings, and they came with the monthly newsletters that looked like something from a cheap printer. They also came with registration paperwork and with brochures, and they came with attitude. They never pressured Miss Nice, but always left insulted, telling her that she should join the HOA that everyone worked so hard to put together. Anytime a neighbor got an earshot of Miss Nice, it was another "join the HOA" pitch. They would always push the advantages of joining the HOA, which is a close-knit community. That they had already, a combined bill for utilities that maybe saved pennies here but lose them somewhere else, a sense of security, no security company had been contacted yet. Also, a disaster insurance program, specialized services for the area, there's no snow, the county sweeps the street and no gardeners had been contacted yet. Also, future prospects, community center and pool. Everyone gets a vote, so it's not just that the board is making the rules. Of course, with manipulative Susan telling everyone, this is how it's properly done in an HOA. The HOA, when they were not doing recruitment drives, were looking for donations for their varying projects. Donate so we can build a community pool, or donate so we can build a community center for our kids, or donate so we can build a community park, or donate so we can build a new parking garage for guest vehicles. The HOA newsletter would always note how much money they missed the goal by or the status of them getting a bond. The newsletter noted all the expenses, the meeting notes summarized, and just about anything else. But something just did not sit well with Miss Nice about the legitimacy of it all. Eventually, the HOA gave up on recruiting her, they just decided to ignore her. Then they turned her into a pariah. Neighbors she had known for most of her life suddenly shunned her as if she had the plague. People avoided her, people spoke over her, or acted as if she was not part of the conversation. People went out of their way to mistreat her and remove any courtesy they had. After 5 years of practically loneliness, Miss Nice put her house on the market. Suddenly, people took notice. People started coming by just to see who was interested in buying Miss Nice's house. Anyone they didn't like, the HOA neighbors would either scare off or they would tell how horrible the neighborhood or this house was. Miss Nice's house sat for nearly a year until finally she let the HOA dictate who would be buying the house. A family of 4 who instantly wanted to become members bought the place. Miss Nice moved out and was saddened to see the place leaving her hands. After a year in California, Miss Nice was watching the news when a report of a hurricane was en route to the community. Miss Nice called up one of her former friends to find if they were gonna be okay. They basically told her to mind her own business as she did not live there anymore. It was not until 6 or 7 months later when she would get an update. Miss Gossip, named in this story for being the neighborhood gossip, you know, the type who cannot keep a good story to save her life, contacts Miss Nice and the two talk like two old friends for several hours. Miss Gossip essentially opened the conversation with the most out of the way to say, "You were right, the HOA was a scam." Go back in time to directly following Hurricane, when everyone returned to the community. They found their houses in many forms of destroyed or ruined. Some people got away with just flood damage, while others nearly lost their roofs. A lot of people had smashed windows, shingles missing, or something as bad as walls collapsing. So the HOA held an emergency meeting. The board very nervously welcomed everyone back and then suggested that everyone use their personal home insurance to start repairs, as the HOA disaster insurance adjusters would take much longer to even get started. One non-board member suggested then that money from the donations be used to start repairs of homes. The HOA could be paid back once the insurance company writes a check. The HOA board told everyone that the funds were locked in a bond and thus inaccessible. The HOA members voted to break the bonds, use the funds and contact the HOA insurance right away nonetheless. The board fretted. It was then that Miss Gossip requested an audit of the HOA books by a CPA to find any loose cash and show the HOA was not being as shady as they were appearing at this moment. The HOA board called it a waste of perfectly good money, but eventually agreed. The CPA report came back. There were no funds anywhere. There was no insurance, there was no services being paid, nothing set up. The HOA members were paying into just a single bank account that had many withdrawals. Quickly under fire, the board members resigned one by one. The CPA dug up that the board had been using the HOA funds like their own piggy bank behind each other's backs. That's right, each board member was stealing in secret behind the backs of each other as well. People started putting things together as the CPA presented the timeline of events and withdrawals, as in, did not board member Debbie take a vacation in the tropics near that withdrawal? Or, hey, isn't that about the time board member Bob bought his new SUV? The HOA members disbanded the HOA after that and began the long track of suing the former board members for the embezzlement. Miss Nice never found out if anyone was charged or not, nor found out the damages. Sorry folks. I'm guessing someone had to be though. Miss Gossip relayed the story to Miss Nice and spent a good half hour apologizing for the way she had treated Miss Nice. Miss Nice still has a chuckle now and then about it. And yeah, thank you so much for posting this awesome HOA story on r/ripe stories. And because it was so good, the next one is the title story of this video, titled How My Uncle Jack Got Out of His HOA, posted by user Medium Savings 4968, also on r/ripe stories. Thanks to my amazing community for posting all these awesome stories. Anyway, this story is more than a decade old. My Uncle Jack tells this story at every single family gathering. I've heard it so many times, it's so old now. Anyway, I gotta put it somewhere or I might go insane. My Uncle Jack lives in Texas and more than a decade ago used to live in an HOA. Uncle Jack is a legal analyst and has worked for several firms in his lifetime. He made some decent cash and found ways to invest when he could. He bought himself a house going in blind, not knowing what an HOA was other than a build fee. To say this HOA was strict would be considered nice. This HOA had practically a rule for everything. Those rules were subdivided and found in a nice dictionary thick pamphlet. The HOA had built its rules and foundations on an older housing agreement that was formed in the very neighborhood sometime in the 50s, when the area was more of a suburban dream, complete with barbecues in every yard and 2 cars being a status thing. Anyways, the HOA had rules for everything. Some examples: your house must be one of the approved colors aforementioned in the subsection below, to which the HOA inspectors would walk around with paint swatches. Paint must be unkempt to the insert quality level and standard, to which HOA inspectors would fine you if the paint was faded in any spot. Lawns must be no more than insert inches, to which HOA inspectors would eyeball it and then fine you anyways. Lawns must be a certain variety of grass, to which inspectors would take grass clippings of your yard to compare. From trash can times to how many pets you're allowed is how meticulous this HOA was. Uncle Jack had horror stories from all his neighbors. Now, this HOA board, even though meticulous, were also wimps when it came to court cases. At the first sign of you taking them to court, they would cave in. In particular, the HOA had strict guidelines against satellite dishes, solar panels and pools. Uncle Jack won against the HOA in the first two categories. Satellite dishes and solar panels are classified technically as utilities. So when Uncle Jack's friend, a prominent lawyer, was prepared to take them to court for denying my uncle the use of a utility, the HOA magically bent the rules for him. The pool was a matter of approvals with so many hoops to jump through, it would be tied up for years. Uncle Jack saw excessive fines after each win, to which he fought again. Each time they met to settle with the HOA would say, "Check your damn rule booklet," and then at the last moment drop the fines with him before it even went to court. Uncle Jack, a legal analyst, goes back home one particular time to go over his rulebooks after another routine fine battle cycle. Uncle Jack notices something, an old rule buried in the beginning of the book, a rule about opting out. It was odds are left over from the elder neighborhood agreement they had simply amended. Uncle Jack excitedly read the rule in simplicity: you may withdraw your home/application from the HOA after paying a full year amount of dues, all fines, debts you owe to the HOA. In itself, it sounded like a crazy amount, but when you did the actual math, it only amounted to $4,100. Uncle Jack puts together a check, puts together a letter of intent, and calls his lawyer to come with him to the board. The board meets with Uncle Jack in private and go jaw-drop when he invokes the rule. At first, the board played it coy, trying to deny a rule like that existed or still had any power to be invoked. Uncle Jack's lawyer showed the rule highlighted. The board then makes the excuse. "Mr. Uncle Jack, the dues have been increased this year and next year. You're gonna need to pay more to opt out." Uncle Jack leaves and tries to return with the amount. This was difficult as the board members avoided him as if he had the plague. For weeks the board members avoided my uncle, so my Uncle Jack finally threatened to conduct this business during a normal board meeting with everyone present there to watch. The board panics and caves in. The HOA's first action post that affair was to try to remove that very rule. The funny part of this HOA is it takes only the board to install a rule, but it takes the full HOA, meaning every member, to remove a rule and 2/3 to amend a rule. And since several members made it a habit of never showing up, the opt-out rule stood. First thing Uncle Jack does, he contacts a contractor. First he changes the floor plan, then updates the house's color and front yard with new flower beds and bushes. Then he adds a pool and a new deck, and finally adding an awning. His neighbors were always referring to him as the thrill seeker daring to take on the wrath of the HOA. The HOA did nothing though, so Uncle Jack decided to push his luck. He showed the rule to everyone and anyone in earshot. In 6 months, a once prominent 60+ house HOA had been reduced to 7 houses. 3 non-due paying board members, 1 non-due paying secretary, and 3 die-hard HOA fans. The HOA board sold their houses and disbanded the HOA. They were heard to say, "We were no longer needed or wanted in this neighborhood." Uncle Jack sold that house for a decent profit and moved with his job some years later. Bigger city, just as cool a house, but without an HOA nor shredded remains of one. The new law firm he works for has a special regular client, the former HOA president, whom as soon as he saw my Uncle Jack said, "I want him on my legal team," pointing straight at Uncle Jack. And yeah, Ripe Stars, if you enjoy these community-posted stories, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even post some star emojis in the comments, because I enjoy these stories very much. The next one is an Am I the A-hole story posted by user sufficient_cap5479 on r/ripe stories. So a little bit about me, I'm a disabled combat veteran, served 25 months in Afghanistan. I have some PTSD issues, mobility issues, and I am in constant pain. I take minimal medication because I don't like feeling doped up, and in September 2021 I celebrated my 17th wedding anniversary with my then wife. I was a 50-year-old male back then and my then wife was a 45-year-old female. Since I'm listed as 100% disabled, my wife had been my caregiver since I was medevaced from Afghanistan in 2011. Now for the story. 3 days after my anniversary, I was feeling extremely tired after lunch, so I dozed off for a little bit. When I woke up, I felt funny and discovered that I had a stroke in my sleep. So my wife drives me to the hospital due to the insane pandemic restrictions in my home state of Oregon. She had to wait in the car while the hospital checked me out. After 3 hours and several tests and medications, they determined that I had a minor stroke and wanted to keep me in the hospital. I convinced them that since I had a full caregiver and they could not find anything to indicate that I was at risk for another stroke, to let me go home. An hour after I got home, my wife had a bag packed and called my oldest daughter to come pick her up. She accused me of cheating on her even though I was never without her or one of my kids because of my disability. Then she left me to recover from the stroke alone. She filed for divorce the next month and never even came back for her belongings. She had her mother come pick her stuff up and gave me the house in the divorce. Fast forward to a month ago and I'm talking to my youngest daughter about me bringing her belongings from her old room to her apartment. She, youngest daughter, 20-year-old female, does not have a driver's license but owns a car and pays for insurance on it since her mom doesn't work. My kids have been paying her expenses. Anyway, back to the story. My daughter says she's happy to come pick up her stuff and I told her it was fine as long as her mother was not with her, as I want nothing to do with her mother. Next thing I know, my ex-wife is blowing up my messages telling me how immature I am for not wanting to be near her for any reason. I reminded her that she abandoned me when I had a stroke and really needed her. She told me I was being childish and only hurting my kids, all of whom are adults and know what she did. So then I blocked my ex-wife. Reddit, am I the a-hole in this? And yeah, Ripe Stars, let's help our fellow Ripe Star here and let him know what you think about this story in the comments. But honestly, I would say it's pretty clear that OP is not the a-hole here. I would rather say, no offense intended, he is the victim here because his wife left him when he was at his weakest. At least that is how I see it. Anyway, a comment said, not the a-hole, it is your wife that left you to fend for yourself. The kids, which you say are adults now, know the story and they are still with her, I guess. Can they see past that she's the scum of the earth and should leave her too? Nobody leaves a person on their most critical time of need. OP then answered, my youngest daughter did her college work remotely online and stayed with me for a few months after her mother left. My oldest comes by several times a week to check on me, etc. The kids have all spent time making sure I was okay, while their mother mooches off of them until they get tired of supporting her. She is living with the last child willing to support her at this point. And now let's move on to the next story. It starts like this. Until last month, I've always assumed that people never commit or do anything without a motive, which I now know is not always the case. My sister recently made a new friend courtesy of the daycare services she uses for her child, and because we all live close, I often see them out together. This new friend of hers has 4 children, 3 teenagers and 1 infant. Anyway, she seemed normal enough when I met her. Perhaps some might say she comes on a little strongly, but that's certainly no biggie. As for the kids, from what my sister has told me, she only really pays any attention to the youngest, which I'm sure creates some tension in their household. Anyway, enough of the context for the time being. Last month I had received a large check from the business I work for as a bonus and had decided to treat myself to something nice. I know a lot of people would consider this more than just something nice, but I'd been thinking of getting it for a while before this point. So I decided to buy a Mercedes and was able to pay for it in full all in one go. I drove out of the dealership feeling obviously very happy and accomplished, and decided the first thing I would do was drive around for a while and just get used to the feeling of the car and all the mechanics. I drove up around most of the houses in my area, selfishly rejoicing in the lingering stares I got. As I was making my way back home, I noticed that the road I usually took was shut for some construction work in the pipes. Anyway, I realized I would have to take the back road route home, which I was already not looking forward to in my brand new car, what with all the potholes and such. Therefore, I drove fairly slowly as not to damage the car and left plenty of space between myself and any cars coming towards me. Just as I was on the last little stretch of road before I would be able to turn back onto regular tarmac, I spotted 3 figures stood at the side of the road. There was no pavement. This was already a fairly odd occurrence. All 3 of them were wearing hoodies pulled far over their heads, so I was unable to see what they looked like. Obviously suspicious, I sped up slightly and drifted out into the middle of the already narrow road to avoid them. All of a sudden, I felt the car lurch and realized that one of my front wheels had dipped into a pothole and caused the car to lurch to one side. I immediately slammed on the brakes as the car had lurched in the direction of a tree on the opposite side of the road to the 3 figures. Just as I had finished shaking myself off from the situation, I heard glass shatter and felt a small amount spray over the back of my neck, causing a small amount of blood to come pouring out. I frantically turned around and watched as the three figures bashed away at my brand new car with their bats that they must have been hiding behind their backs. "What on earth are you doing?" I yelled, utterly confused as to what was happening. They stayed silent other than their continuous laughing and just carried on smashing my car all over the place. They knocked off both mirrors, slashed the tires, made numerous dents in the sides and smashed the windows. Before they could go any further, I got out of my car and continued yelling, "What do you think you're doing? Do you have any idea how much these damages are gonna cost you?" "Come on, old man, it's just a bit of fun," one of the three replied, and I knew I recognized the voice from somewhere. The other two laughed and they began to advance on me with their bats raised. Before they could take another step, I whipped out the gun I keep in my vest and I aimed it at them sharply. They froze, removing their hoods and putting their hands up. I immediately recognized them as the three teens of my sister's new friend, and they clearly recognized me as they looked at each other like they knew how much they messed up. "Look, mister, we were just having a bit of a laugh, you know," one of the boys spoke up, his voice shaking from fear. "How is this a bit of a laugh? You've completely wrecked my car." "I'm a veteran, so I promise you my shots never miss," I responded, adding on the last part as I could practically see a plan forming on their faces to make a dash for it. "Well, you cannot possibly prove it was us who did this, right? And it's not like you're actually gonna shoot us." Another one of the boys spoke up, shrugging his shoulders and then quickly making a dart down the road. The other two looked at each other and followed. I lowered my gun and stared at the wreckage that was left behind, wondering if I had somehow dreamt up such a bizarre situation. Luckily for me, the garage where I had bought the car had fitted two cameras, one on the front and one on the back. I quickly called the police to get them down here as soon as possible. I informed them that I was carrying a weapon, so they would not be spooked upon approach. When they got here, I recounted everything that had happened, and even they found it puzzling that three boys would randomly attack out of nowhere. Once I loaded the footage that I had downloaded of the cameras to my phone, they of course believed me. Roughly 30 minutes later, a tow truck arrived to take the wreckage away so that it was no longer blocking the road. I made a police report and was informed that I would be waiting to hear back for a couple of days. As I was close to home already, I had no trouble walking back the extra journey, although I was certainly more anxious than I had been of that morning. A couple days later, I was walking to my local shop when my sister's friend came charging at me at the speed of light, holding some paper in her hand. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, shoving the paper at my chest. I quickly skimmed it and saw that it was a court appeal for the three boys. I had received a similar one that morning. "It is what it is," I replied and made a move to walk past her after handing it back. No, my boys would never do anything wrong. Why are you making up such a lie, you horrible man?" "You won't win this case, it's a waste of your time," she rambled on, stepping in front of me to block my path. "Let's just see what happens in court then, shall we?" I responded with a smirk and walked past her once more. This time we were nearer to the store and there was a guard nearby, and seeing what was happening, he came over, which quickly stopped her following me. And then a few weeks later, I found myself in court with the three boys. In my police report, I had obviously pressed charges, so here we were. We were in court for no more than 2 hours. The footage I provided was more than enough evidence that the boys were guilty of the crimes I accused them of. That did not stop them trying to lie their way out of it, however. One of them claimed that they were high off of unknown substances, which, as you can imagine, worked out even further against them. Another claimed that I purposefully swerved and tried to run them over, but again, the footage shows that I hit a pothole and swerved in the opposite direction. They ended up being sentenced to 200 hours of community service each, as well as a significant amount of time behind bars and a debt totaling the amount of the car to be repaid to me in full within the next 6 months. Of course, given that they were going to be behind bars, it would be the mother taking on this payment, something she clearly was not happy about, as she cursed and screamed at me as we were leaving the courthouse. Their mother also ended up being charged with mild cases of child neglect, considering how odd her son's behavior was, and her infant was removed from her care. My sister understandably stopped talking to her and cut her off completely. Moral of the story: although you might think just because you've done nothing wrong, bad things can still happen to you, and they might come in the form of 3 teenage boys. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripe Stories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.